I want you to stop and think for just a moment about what you would consider the most significant discovery or invention or event that has taken place over the course of your lifetime. What one thing that you think has had the biggest impact upon the life of our society in terms of shaping the course of our daily lives. Now, obviously, your answer will depend upon how old you are. So the answers we give might be very different, but still, what do you think? What has made the biggest difference in your life? You think it was computers? What about cell phones? Or antibiotics? Or Facebook? Or the civil rights movement? Or something else entirely? Perhaps, for example, a piece of music? Or a book? What do you think it is? I really have no idea what the answer to that question would be, nor do I think that anyone else does either, at least not yet. And nor, for that matter, do I think they could come up with that answer anytime soon. Because I don't think the answer, the real answer, will be apparent for still a very long time to come. Certainly beyond the lifespan of any but maybe the very youngest of us. But whatever this one big thing turns out to have been, I have a gut feeling that it's not going to be any of those things that I mentioned earlier. That in fact, it's going to turn out to have been something that none of us would ever have guessed. And might even be something we're not even yet aware of. That it may be something so subtle that its real impact may not at all be obvious for a very long time to come, and yet so profound that over time it completely changes life as we know it. Maybe even has already changed life in ways that we just haven't noticed. After all, if you'd asked the same question to 1,000 people, even 10,000 people in the first century of the Common Era, I doubt a single one of them would have responded that the most important thing to have happened during that time was the birth of Jesus Christ. And yet I don't think there's any question but that that is so. 100, maybe even 150 years later, you might have found someone willing to say that, but probably not much before then. Because even though Christianity spread quite rapidly throughout the Roman Empire and even beyond, it still was a very long time before the number of Christians was anything more than a tiny minority of the population. It just didn't seem to be all that big of a deal for a very long time. And yet all of that time, the world was changing. Changing in ways that no one would have ever predicted, and changing, for the most part, in ways that no one even much noticed. In fact, I don't think even the Christians realized just how much things were changing, mostly because they were changing in ways that none of them seemed to have expected. Now, to be sure, they were expecting change. They were expecting very significant change. But it was not the change that actually happened. Though it's hard to say for sure because we know so little about what was going on in the early years of the church, by which I mean the time roughly from the death of Jesus to the appearance of the first gospel, which was presumably the Gospel of Mark, which is to say a period of roughly 40 or so years. The only thing we know about those years comes from the letters that are found in the New Testament, but even most of them date only from the latter part of that period. We have almost nothing at all from the first 10 or 15 years after the death of Jesus, except for the book of Acts, but that was a book written many, many years later. What is clear, though, is that even by the time Paul began his ministry, which probably sometime in the mid to late 40s, something had happened. Something was already changing. But it took a while longer before anyone much realized what was happening. The problem then, just as it is now, is that people were expecting something else. And so they didn't see what was actually happening. They were expecting these big changes brought about by the kind of things that we always think are going to change the world. For the early Christians, they were almost totally focused on the expected return of Jesus, a return they fervently believed would happen any day, would certainly happen during the course of their lifetime. And when Jesus returned, there were going to be big changes. You could bet on that for sure. Because they believed when he came back, he was going to finish everything that had been left unfinished by his untimely death. He would establish his kingdom of justice and righteousness, and if the Romans got in the way of his doing that, well, then he would take care of them as well. And it was just a matter of time, a matter simply of when, not if. So certain were they that this was going to happen. That is what everyone was expecting. That is what everyone was looking for. In fact, Paul writes the first of his letters, the one we know as 1 Thessalonians, at least it's the first we have, because he's afraid that Jesus is going to return before Paul is able to visit the church there to talk to them. So he sends the letter on ahead just in case. But it didn't happen. Certainly not the way that everyone expected. And that could very easily have been the end of Christianity. Just as the failure of their predictions of the end of the world has meant the demise of countless religious movements over the years. So why didn't Christianity, surely disappointed by the failure of Jesus to return as they had all expected, why didn't it disappear? Why didn't people lose faith in the whole enterprise and just go back to their former ways of life? Why? Because I think people, and in particular Paul, over the course of his ministry, began to sense even before they could actually see that something had already happened. That things were already changing. That the new life that they had expected to appear only with the return of Jesus had in fact already come and was being lived out in these little communities that the Christians called churches. Not that the changes that were taking place were the sort of things they had expected to happen. the kind of things that we always think are going to change the world. Nothing like the Son of Man descending through the clouds with legions of angels. In fact, I doubt many folks even thought of what was going on as changes at all, except for some of the people who didn't like them. And certainly no one would have thought of them as changing the world. And yet, amazingly enough, in time, that's exactly what happened. They changed the world. And they're still changing the world, at least in those places where the gospel is still heard and, more importantly, lived. Places where people are still answering the call to follow me. So what was it that was happening and no one even much noticed? You know, it actually doesn't seem like all that much. Certainly not the sort of thing you'd expect would change the world. All it was, really, was just all these people getting together in these little communities called churches. Now, they were coming together at first out of a shared hope that Christ would be returning soon. But in the meantime, while they waited for that to happen, they got together on a regular basis and shared a meal and their hopes for that day to come. And granted, it was fairly unusual for Jews and Gentiles to sit down and share a meal with one another, and that did cause a bit of a problem. That sort of thing really didn't happen much in those days, and it wasn't exactly what you'd call common for rich people to sit down for a meal at a table next to poor people, some of whom were even slaves. And it certainly wasn't very common for women to stand up and speak on such occasions. In fact, that also seems to have upset a few people, not the least of which was Paul, afraid that it would be a distraction, afraid that it would keep people from looking for that day yet to come. Until Paul realized what was happening. Until he realized that while they were also focused on Christ's expected return, while they were all sitting around waiting for the big changes, the earth-shaking changes that were bound to occur when he did return, something extraordinary had already happened. The new world that they so longed for was breaking out right there in their very midst. And it really was a new world. And it really did, in time, change the whole world. And it all happened without their even realizing it. Because they'd all been expecting something else, something big. Not just people sitting around a table sharing a meal. How was that supposed to change the world? I think the very same thing is true today. All of us have hopes and dreams for this world. Hopes and dreams of a better world, of a world without so much pain and suffering. A world where no one goes hungry and everyone has a chance. A world without so much hatred and bitterness and conflict. A world where the color of your skin or the language that you speak doesn't make any difference at all. It's the dream that brings us here to church. And it's a beautiful dream. But it's a bold dream, an ambitious dream. And like other bold, ambitious dreams, we sometimes think it's going to take big, earth-shaking changes to get there. Changes of the sort that are far beyond anything that any of us can do or contribute to. So like those early Christians, we sit back and wait. We wait for the big thing to happen. We wait for the days when the skies will open and Christ will come down and we'll all storm the barricades of injustice. But Jesus didn't say to those first disciples, "Wait for me." He said, "Follow me." And that's what Jesus is saying to us as well. Follow me. And if we did, if we just followed him, not just individually, but as a community, this thing that those early Christians called a church, if we did, I think you might be surprised at what might happen. What might happen without even our noticing just how much the world was changing. You might be surprised.